Herod stood facing an open window in his palace, gaze transfixed. It was not his palace that enchanted him, however. No, though he had rebuilt it to be even more magnificent than ever before. Nor was it the beauty of the city of Jerusalem that caught his eye. No, not even Mount Zion, the home of his land, could capture his attention this night. Without thinking, he held up a hand and encircled a single star with his fingers. It was small, but it shone bright, standing out in the night sky like a beacon. "Such a little thing," he whispered. He clenched his fist. "But you will not be the death of my kingdom." He already knew the Magi would not return. His spies had all but confirmed as much. All he needed was the final confirmation, and he would act. As if to confirm his thoughts, a knock on the door echoed through the room, and a voice called out, "Your servant Eleazar, sire." "Let him in," Herod said, taking a seat on his throne. Herod's chief of staff entered the room and scurried over to Herod's throne. He took a knee as he spoke, the words coming out in a rush of air. We followed the Magi, my lord. They have taken the eastern road. They clearly have no intention of returning." Herod felt his hand curl into a tight fist. He was angry, he knew, but in truth, he felt justified. He knew what he had to do. "Summon the general," he said, standing once again. "We have work to do." As we gather together once more, friends, to delve into the Christmas story in Matthew chapter 2, we enter into the third act of our tale, and it is a heavy act indeed. It's hard to read such stories in the scriptures. I've spoken with friends who have said, how can you believe in the Bible when it contains such horrific stories, such terrible depictions of violence as the one we are to read today? But I really believe that the reason this story is a part of the Advent story, the Christmas story, is because I believe it tells the tale of a God who enters in at the point of pain in the human story, who doesn't shy away from the pain, he doesn't shy away from the hard topics, the hard conversations. But he has a heart for the places of pain, and so he enters in a place of pain. So if you come this morning, and perhaps this past year, past month, past 10 years, I don't know how it's been for you, but if there is a place of pain, I believe this story is about a God who deeply cares, and that is exactly where he enters. He has grace, empathy, and love for. So journey with me for just a few minutes, for a few moments. We're going to read our story here. It begins in Matthew chapter 2, verse 16. It says, "Then Herod, when he saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, he became furious." We're going to pause there. He became furious. Somehow, we spoke about week 1 that Herod, he finds this news that a baby is to be born, this king, and it's the Messiah who will be the king of the Jews. Now, this was Herod's title, as we learned in our first week. He was the king of the Jews. And so to learn that a new baby has been born, that's supposed to be the king of the Jews, it triggers within Herod, it seems to, within the story, a deep anger, a deep insecurity, we could even say paranoia. Now, a little bit of background to the story. We spoke about this again week 1, but just for those maybe who missed it, Herod was an interesting king. This is the king known as Herod the Great, if you wanted to look him up. A very interesting historical figure. And Herod the Great, he was interesting because he was not actually born Jewish. He was adopted into the Jewish family. And so because of that, there was a bit of doubt about how Jewish he really was, if he really was a son of Israel. And so because of that, there was a bit of suspicion around his kingship. Can this man truly lead us? You see, he was appointed by the governing authorities at the time. And so because of that, many of the people felt that he wasn't really one of them. He was one of the powers that be. He represented the man. He wasn't really one of the people. And so because of this, we see Herod's kingship fraught with distrust and paranoia, suspicion. And so here we learn in verse 16, that when he learns the wise men who were supposed to come back around and circle back and tell him where this baby was born, because he said, allow me to worship him too. But the wise men do not, because an angel appears to them in a dream and says, don't go back there, because Herod has malicious intent. Go another way home. And so they do. So when Herod learns this, he becomes furious, the text says. And one must ask the question, why? It brings to mind a conversation I had with my therapist a while back where he talked about different levels of emotions. He talked about how oftentimes when we experience emotions, we're experiencing what's called level 2 emotions. These are things like anger, right? Frustration, fury. We're experiencing level 2 emotions, but really hidden beneath the level 2 emotion is a level 1 emotion: shame, fear. And I really believe what we see here in King Herod here is a bit of a fear. And fear of what? Well, we see that this king, if he is to be a king of the Jews, he threatens everything that Herod has built, right? He threatens his kingship, threatens his kingdom. Because there cannot be two kings. And so Herod, in his paranoia, his insecurity, he takes steps in his heart that will lead to catastrophic actions with his hands. I believe the story is telling us a deep truth, a few truths, but the first one is I think that the coming of Christ, I think it challenges us and confronts us on a level 1 emotions level, right? It challenges us in the deepest places of our life, in the gut level, right? As the king comes into my life and challenges my kingdom and says, I'm the king now. Reminds me of that old movie, Captain Phillips, where they took over the boat, right? And the pirate says, I'm the captain now. Look at me, I'm the captain now. Except it's the opposite. Jesus comes as a benevolent king, a king who is really a father, a good king. And he says, I'm the king now. Will you bend the knee? And to this question, Herod says, no. And so the coming of Christ confronts Herod and us on the emotions level. It forces us to ask important level 1 emotions questions. And I really, really think it invites us into some deep introspection of ourselves. Perhaps the question for ourselves to ask is, are we addressing our level 1 emotions? These are questions like, why was I so angry when she said that? Why was I so frustrated? Why did I snap at that comment? Why did I yell at my children when they did that thing? Why was I so quick to run away? Why did I hide upon feeling emotions of failure, of being not enough? Why did I run and flee and hide? What is causing this? Let's dig a little bit deeper. And these are the questions I believe the story is inviting us to ask. The questions that Herod himself did not ask. And so we see where not addressing these things leads him and leads us. And so the story continues in verse 17. It says, and he sent and killed all the male children in Bethlehem and in all that region who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had ascertained from the wise men. In verse 17. He sent and killed all the male children in Bethlehem. And immediately our hands go up and we think to ourselves, this man was so paranoid that he enacted infanticide, killed all the male children in the city just to stop one. Just to stop one. He was so racked was he by fear and paranoia, so lost in self-protection, in a scarcity mentality. Herod does something truly evil, truly diabolical. Not only something evil, but something intrinsically connected to the Israel story, right? Those of you who know the Israel story, we know the story of the Exodus, right? And Herod, king of Israel, he would have known the story of the Exodus. He knows the tale of the subjugation of Israel, how their firstborn sons were murdered by a Pharaoh full of fear and feeling threatened by his own power. What was it that the Pharaoh said at the time? They may become too numerous and they may rise up against us and overthrow our kingdom. And so here in some sort of strange poetic irony, we have the king of the people group whose firstborn sons were murdered, murdering the firstborn sons or murdering the sons, the male children, of his own people. He has become the very villain that his people once escaped. And so the cycle turns, and our eyes are open to an endless and unstoppable wheel throughout history in the human world, the cycle of violence in the world. In his book, Exclusion and Embrace, author Miroslav Volf, professor at Yale University, he says this to address the cycle of violence in the world. He writes, "Instead of wanting to forgive, we instinctively seek revenge. An evil deed will not be owned for long. It demands instant repayment in kind. The trouble with revenge, however, is that it enslaves us. We become slaves to the cycle of revenge. An eye for an eye. You did this to me, so I'm going to do this to you. But then it creates in them the need to do the same thing back to you, and then the cycle just ends, just continues, never ends. Perhaps that's why Representative Barbara Lee, in the year 2001, only 3 days after the attacks on 9/11, she stood up in the Senate and said this: "As we act, let us not become the evil we deplore." It seems that Representative Barbara Lee knew something about the human, that as a bunch of very violent acts were being put in place in the U.S. government in the year 2001, legal acts that would allow us to go to war with the culprits behind 9/11, she raised a hand amidst all of the anger, amidst all of the pain, the genuine pain, from real harm done. This is not a dismissing of the harm that was done on that day, but she raised a hand, the only one to vote against, and said, "May we not become the evil that we deplore. May we not become the very thing that we oppose in our pursuit of justice. May the justice never turn to revenge, to retribution just for the sake of blood." And so the cycle continues. Continuing on in the story, Matthew, as he writes his gospel, he does something really interesting next. If we notice what's going on, if we read between the lines, he says this in verse 18: "A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping in loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be comforted because they are no more." And if you read it in most Bibles, it's kind of put in a little section as if it's poetic. It's quoting. And that's because it's quoting from the book of Jeremiah, chapter 31. Now, what's interesting about this quote, it seems kind of random. It seems, very metaphorical, right? For any of us who know the biblical story, we know Ramah is a place in the Bible. Rachel is a character in the Bible. So what is he doing here? What is he getting at? Well, for those who remember, Rachel, this is the mother of Joseph, right, with the coat of many colors, the wife of Jacob. And what this is referring to is that old story, right, where Joseph, he was the favorite by his father, and his brothers, in an act of jealousy and revenge, end up deciding or creating a plot to murder him. But then with some stepping in by his oldest brother, they decide to soften it by just selling him into slavery. And so they end up selling Joseph into slavery. He ends up in Egypt. But all that while, we learn that Rachel, his mother, she thinks that he has been killed because they bring back the cloak, right? If you remember the story, they bring back the cloak and it's covered in the blood of a slain lamb. So they bring back this cloak and they say, "Your son was set upon and he was murdered by wild animals." And so all these years, Rachel believes her son is dead. It depicts this mourning, this lamentation by Rachel as she weeps. She refuses to be comforted because they are no more. The prophet Jeremiah, he uses later on this image in Jeremiah chapter 31 to speak to the children of Israel because they are now in exile in Babylon, and he writes to them. He uses the same image of mourning their children who have been slain by the Babylonian Empire, who've been taken into captivity. He uses the same image of Rachel. Rachel is weeping for her children who are in captivity, who have been murdered, who have been killed. In some ways, it feels like a universal lament for the cycle of violence and war and retribution and death in the world. A universal lament for everything that's wrong. Some people will say to me, Pastor Anthony, I just don't know how the Bible is relevant to this world and my life. And I just feel like I read this story with all due respect to that perspective, because I understand that perspective. I understand how the Bible can feel disconnected or irrelevant or some pie in the sky up in the clouds. But I just feel like, with all due respect, this is a story that's more relevant than ever, right? We live in a world torn by war and violence and pain, right? This is a story connected to the most painful parts of the human story. This is not only my story individually or yours, but ours collectively, right? When we look around the world and we see war and violence, we see starvation and death and famine. Look no further than Ukraine and Russia, to Israel, to Gaza, Palestine, Sudan. It's everywhere. People hurting, violence and death, no matter the reason, no matter the cause. It's still violence and death. One party commits an act, the other retaliates, and so the wheel turns. So the cycle continues. And I just want to zoom in a little bit on the war in Sudan, just to maybe make this a little more tangible for us, because I actually did not know this information. So this week I looked up into the civil war that's going on in Sudan right now. It's been going on for over almost 2 years at this time. And I actually did not know how truly terrible it really is, because there's so many terrible things going on in the world. But I did not know really how devastating it is. I want to read to you some stats here. This is from the United Nations, one of their agencies. They said more than 10 million people have been displaced from their homes. 10 million people. This number, it's almost hard to comprehend, but just to give it a little context, there are 1.3 million in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex. 1.3 million people. There's around 2 million people in Houston. 10 million people have been displaced from their homes in Sudan. So that would mean 10 times about the amount of Dallas. Their homes have been destroyed. They've had to flee for their lives, and they're homeless. They live in refugee camps. They don't have anywhere to go. They don't have running water. These are people on the edge of survival. 10 million. And they don't even know how many people have been killed in this conflict. Some say 60,000, and then others will estimate all the way up to 150,000 people have died since this war began. Now, it's just a snapshot, and we could go into the past history of Sudan, which is very, very interesting. There are all sorts of wars. This is, in fact, the third civil war that Sudan has had. And so this is a cycle of violence that has perpetrated, and it's very complicated. I don't claim to know all the details about it, but it's been going on ever since the 80s. There have been these wars that have perpetuated over and over. People fighting for their freedom, fighting back, the opposing parties. And here we find the cycle of violence. It brings to mind Lamentations chapter 5, as it reads, "Our fathers sinned and are no more, and we bear their iniquities." Bit of a heavy word, speaking about the power of decisions made by those who came before. We're caught in the cycle of violence. We never chose it, right? The children of Sudan, of Ukraine, of Gaza, of Israel, they didn't choose the wars of their parents, right? And yet, they pay the price. They bear the sins of their fathers, bear their iniquities. And so the word comes to us, I believe, through the voice of the prophets, through the voice of this story, this really difficult story, right in the center of the Christmas tale, right? It's hard for us to stomach a little bit, I think, sometimes. Perhaps I think that's why I've always read the Luke version of the Christmas story, right? Because the Christmas story happens in Luke chapter 2 and in Matthew chapter 2. I've always read the Luke version. Because the Luke version is the fun and fuzzy version. The Luke version is the version, right, that's read in the mall perhaps, or you find in Hallmark movies. We speak about it so easily because the Luke version doesn't include this section, right? And one might ask, why didn't Luke include this but Matthew did? Well, we have to remember, Matthew's writing to a predominantly Jewish audience, whereas Luke is writing to his friend who's a non-believer, a secular person, right? So Luke, when he's writing, he knows that his audience won't understand the intricacies of the Jewish story, so he doesn't go into all of this quoting what's happening things like that. But Matthew knows his reader. He knows this is meant for a Jewish audience, so he includes this history because it's important. And so as we read this story in Matthew chapter 2, and it's right in the middle of the Christmas story, it interrupts our tendency towards believing that Christmas is only about cheer. Don't get me wrong, cheer is beautiful. Don't get me wrong, the Christ comes as a baby to bring life and cheer and joy, absolutely. And yet for some reason it was important to God that this part was in the story, that the pain was there. If any of you perhaps have experienced Christmas, and I know in a room this size, I know there are some, at least a few, who have experienced Christmas not only as a time of cheer and joy, but also as a time of pain, also as a time of loneliness, of missing loved ones, of recalling previous Christmases with those whose faces are not around the table anymore. It can be heavy, it can be hard, it can be difficult. There's pain, there's joy, yes, but there's also pain. And so I love this story. I think this story is as relevant as ever because it speaks to a God who does not ignore the pain, who cares deeply about the pain. He enters into that point in the story, into yours and into mine. And he says, this is exactly why I'm here, is for this. And yet we have to wrestle with the dissonance of this story, of the violence. It's almost as if calling out to us from the story itself is the question, who will end? Who will end the cycle of violence? Who will finally break it? Because you can point to all sorts of violence throughout the years. You can point to violence done by the church and by the non-believer alike, by secular and religious governments. Over the years, we find that the cycle continues to turn. And so who will end the cycle of violence? It reminds me of last night I went to a little candlelight service. There was a little memorial service, and there were only a few people there, just 3 or 4 of us. We sat around these candles, and one of them shared a story about a death in his family, one of the people there. And something he said really broke me, and it caused me to feel deep pain with him. He said, I'm tired of preaching, of talking about hope. I want to see it. I'm tired of talking about it. I want to see it. I'm tired of reading about it. I want to see it. And for any of you who have ever lost someone, I would guess that you have felt this. I'm tired of talking about it. God, when will we see it? I'm tired of singing soon and very soon. When will we see it? When will it be today? When will soon make way to today? So this lament comes to us heavy and weighty. It is not to be dismissed with platitudes and religious sayings just so that we can escape our own discomfort. Rather, maybe we could be like Jesus and enter into the pain. Maybe perhaps there's someone in your life, in your family, in your circle, who's experiencing a difficult holiday. Maybe it's time to enter into the pain. Maybe it's time to ask. And you know what's interesting about asking about pain? Sometimes I'm afraid, and as a pastor I get to ask about pain all the time. Sometimes I'm afraid to ask because I'm worried, man, will this be too hard for them, too difficult? I can see someone's going through a really hard time and I'm afraid to ask about it. But then I have the courage to speak up and say, hey, could you tell me a little bit about when your mother passed away? And what's interesting is, every single time I've asked about the pain, the person has told me the story. Almost never does someone say, no, I don't want to talk about it. And that's not to say that could never happen. Some people have boundaries, you want to respect those. But almost every time that I've asked, the response has been, of course. Sure. And then you go on a journey with them. And so I wonder, perhaps this holiday is a moment for us to enter into the pain, just like the God who entered into our pain, into our story. Perhaps we could enter into the story of another. And I love that this story actually doesn't end here, but it continues on, right? We know how the story ends, that this God, he comes as a baby, but then he dies on a cross, giving us hope. as a promise that he comes to break the cycle of violence once and for all. That this God is actually Joseph at the end of the story, right? His brothers sell him out. But then do you remember what happens a little bit later in that story when his brothers come and meet him? He forgives them for what they did. He ends the cycle of violence. And so this story is a story of pain, yes. A story of violence, yes. A story of babies who have been murdered. It's a story of the cycle of violence in the world. And also, it's a story of the only hope we have for this cycle to be broken. For the Jesus who is Joseph forgiving his brothers, absorbing the pain into himself and saying, it ends here, it stops with me. The pain stops here. And now, going forward, forever, you are invited into a redeemed future. And you know what's crazy? I'm going a little long, but I have to share this with you. You know what's crazy is in Jeremiah chapter 31, verse 16, he says this. And this kind of blows my mind. Right after saying, the voice of Rachel cries out and she is weeping for her children. The very next verse, in verse 17, he says, there is hope for your future, declares the Lord, and your children shall come back to their own country. Now, how could this be true? Jeremiah is speaking to people in exile. How could it be true that they could come back to their own country? But he's saying there will come a day when you will be renewed, when you can truly come home, when the children who have passed away, when those children that you're mourning for, Rachel, who have been lost, they will be redeemed, they will be restored, they will be resurrected. And so we have this hope that is not just a story or a fairy tale or a myth, but a true hope of a God who says, every child that passed away I see, and I will redeem, and I will restore, and I will resurrect. Something we can count on forever. And so, as the apostle says in Thessalonians, let us now encourage one another with these words. Amen.